Well, greetings, Professor Brown and Professor Dermaz. It's my pleasure to welcome you both as our special guests to History 1635, which is a spring 2024 course on histories of religion and violence, sponsored by the SNF IDEA program at Penn. I'm Dan Sheely, and in addition to teaching this history course, I am the Perry Collegium Executive Director of Penn's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, as well as the Director of the Collegium Institute, to which we're grateful for making this conversation possible. Before I begin and hand things over to Professor Dermaz to lead the conversation, please let me say a brief word about our distinguished guests here. Professor Peter Brown, here on our screen, is the Rollins Professor of History Emeritus at Princeton University. He has been credited, rightly, with creating an entire field of study known as the world of late antiquity, as no longer just a back alley between the classical and medieval era. Perhaps less well-known, but also rightly, his spellbinding lectures bringing this colorful world to life for generations of students have even inspired the names of their own household pets or pets-to-be, including the names of a Roman emperor's man-eating bears, Goldflake and Innocence, as well as the Abbasid caliph's gift of an elephant to Charlemagne named Abuldabaz. His scholarship has made not just important contributions to subjects as varied as our understanding of power and authority in the Roman Empire, of sex and renunciation, of Christianity and the invention of the poor, and on Augustine of Hippo and the cult of the saints, but that in all those cases, his books and articles continue to serve as both classic and agenda-setting works. He is, simply put, among the most eminent historians alive in the Anglophone world, and as it was put elsewhere, is among the giants in humanistic scholarship more broadly. So we're honored and thrilled to have him joining us this afternoon. Professor Rehan Dermaz is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and Faculty Research Fellow at Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Studies Center. Her first monograph, Stories Between Christianity and Islam, Saints, Memory, and Cultural Exchange in Late Antiquity and Beyond, examines the transmission of non-biblical saints, stories, and cults from Christianity to Islam. Her most recent research moves back and forth from the ancient world to the modern age as she analyzes the ways in which Middle Eastern immigrants in New York City articulated religion and religious diversity in 19th century America. So we're delighted to have her lead this conversation with Professor Brown about the significant interrelation of stories about religious conflict from the past and present. So I'll pass things over to Professor Dermaz in a moment, but perhaps I can begin, Professor Brown, with the first question. And this first question really comes from your memoir that just came out at the end of last year, Journeys of the Mind. And you begin this story, your own story, with your experience growing up in the Protestant minority of Southern Catholic Ireland. And so I wonder, you say a little bit about this in that first chapter, but to what extent has your own experience of religious conflict and community either shaped, paralleled, or diverged from your mapping of the experience of religious conflict and community in late antiquity?
Oh, that's already a $64,000 question. And I don't want to go into sort of sage mode about it. Violence and religious violence is a painful topic, and we continue to be puzzled by it. I think if I did contribute anything at when in my book on journeys and in my own memories, it was perhaps an awareness of how to put it, intolerance is, how to put it, something which doesn't need to happen the whole time, but what matters is that it can happen. And I think that one of the experiences which certainly formed me was the constant sense that as Protestants in the Republic of Ireland, and don't forget, this is the Republic of Ireland of a long time ago. This is the wartime years of the 1940s, when it was a very young republic. It was a state trying to find itself and its own identity. And therefore, whether one was a full Irishman or not, whether one was a Catholic or a Protestant, were issues which affected us all the more intimately because we were part of an experiment in state formation. This is very different from the, in many ways, happier Ireland of our own time. But I certainly grew up among people who felt themselves fully Irish, but not by the common definition of being Irish, which indeed in most images of Irishmen and of Irish people and of Irish history was predominantly Catholic. It's made me more sympathetic, I think, and more interested in those sort of common links of shared community which held back intolerance. It's very easy to talk about intolerance in terms of its nastier, most, how to put it, most obvious and blatant manifestations, but it's the feeling that it could happen that I think is just as important. And certainly when I began my own work as a scholar, for instance, I began with St. Augustine, not because of his confessions or his City of God, but more because of his involvement in the mean, dirty business of the clash of Christians in North Africa, Catholic versus Donatist, those who resorted to occasional terrorism against those who used the terror of the laws, to use Augustine's awesome phrase. It meant that these were things which I somehow related to. It's hard to put a finger on, but when one is a young student, there are things that leave you cold and there are things that really turn you on. And certainly in all my writings up to the publication of my Augustine of Hippo and beyond, the issue was, how did intolerance happen? What held it back? These were my primary questions. That is a long time ago. This dates from the late the 1960s. But I think the lessons which I learned then came from my own background, not from my English education, and were of lasting importance. I hope that answers your question, Dan.
That's great. I will move over to Professor Clements.
I'll take the microphone from Professor Chili. Thank you so much. Professor Brown, thank you so much for joining. Let me join the cheerful crowd here. You're not seeing the rest of the classroom, but we have a bunch of students here who are eagerly listening to you. And I'm so beyond honored to be speaking with you today. I will just follow up with another question. And I know you already said that this is a big question for you, but I'm just wondering what after 1987, right? The Journeys of the Mind leaves us right there, and you explained that you wanted to stop there. But then I want to just ask you to say a little bit more about how your experiences and observances of your life in America and back in the UK in the last 2.5 decades changed, or whether they changed, about your approach to religious violence or conflict and controversy in antiquity. So this is just a kind of a clunky way of asking, so what happened after 1990s, and how did those years shape your intellectual curiosities, especially when it comes to religious conflict in late antiquity?
Well, I think there is one very obvious starting point, which is from 1987, 88, I began to travel in Turkey. That brought me up against, in my travels throughout Turkey. I mean, this was for me a very important experience, to really look at a large country also facing issues of religious identity at almost every turn. And I think that this certainly kept alive and actually challenged me to recalibrate some of the questions which I had been asking myself, 10, even 20 years previously. I think this was particularly important because one of the reasons that I ended my own account and began on a new tack was, of course, the end of the Cold War. This also was the end of a huge authoritarian bloc and how people coped afterwards. So I would certainly say that some of my earliest interests were indeed shaped by my previous experiences and then brought into a new focus. And one of the great focuses was, of course, how does one deal with a distant past? How does one reconcile and come together and bring together the extraordinary wealth and depth of a sense of the past, which is anyone who travels in Turkey is up against? Monuments that may go back to the days of the Hittites, passes from that to classical cities that are still there as if they've gone to sleep in the age of the Emperor Justinian, and then to see beside them the great mosques, the great madrasas, the great poor relief centers, that are the pride of Ottoman Turkey, to see so many pasts in so many different layers, each of them with their sense of a majoritarian pride and with the problems of those who don't quite fit in. But I do feel that this led me not necessarily to confront the issue of religious violence and conflict frontally, but to deal with, in the first hand, the images, the representations, the way in which people spoke about the triumph of Christianity, the closing of the temples, the conversion of the Jews and of the pagans. That was one of my principal concerns. And then also, how did these great societies, how did they actually cope with those which only half belonged? And this was not necessarily religious dissidents, it was those who had fallen off the bandwagon, as it were. That is, how do you deal with the poor? And what are the rights, what are the duties of the rich towards the poor? That was something which actually did not concern me when I first began. I think because in Ireland that was not the primary problem. From certainly the end of the Cold War, the emergence of the Soviet dissident movement in the years before it, new problems presented themselves. And I think that historians have a terrible gift for being interested in things when they go wrong. You can tootle along with the golden age of Rome without anybody paying any attention. But the moment things get bad, then the historians get going. And I think to study how a society deals with its own problems, problems of poverty, problems of religious dissent, is something which historians must be constantly training themselves to do. Creating a new language, looking in for sort of different examples, looking outside the normal canon of agreed texts. When things get bad, that's where they get going.
Thank you so much for this. My follow-up question is actually exactly that last sentence that you just said. You talked about these canonized texts and canonized narratives. And you said a few minutes ago, after Professor Chili's question, how there were certain narratives about Augustine and his narration of the past was very interesting to you, and his narration of religious conflict was very interesting to you. So I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on these historical narratives that we work with, and especially when we talk about religious conflict and controversy, the majority of the narratives are really dark, gloomy narratives of holy war and really grim destruction and violence. And your work and your students' work show the nuances of religious conflict, but still we operate with these rather conventional narratives of violence. So in your career, what narratives have you used? Have you found really interesting or outstanding? Which narratives should we read, or would you recommend students to read if they wanted to develop a nuanced understanding of religious conflict? So can you reflect a little bit more on how we use stories of the past?
I think that there the historian has to be the one who tears narratives apart. It's his real duty, a bit like the ancient philosopher, to actually try to tell the truth about what happened. And this means that one is constantly up against the deep human wish, and it's a wish which one should never look down on, but it's a very strong wish, and its strength we shouldn't underestimate. The wish for a coherent narrative of their own past, linking into one's own present. And certainly one of the moments where I found myself having to change my mind once again was when I realized, to my great excitement, was that the various narratives of the rise of Christianity and its triumph in the Roman world were all of them in many ways constructs. They were not how things were, they were how people wished to think they had been. And then what, of course, was very exciting was these narratives varied all over the place. If it had just been one simple triumphal narrative of the rise of, say, the Catholic Church in Western Europe, with the normal cast of characters, Constantine, St. Ambrose, Augustine, Gregory VII, that would have been fine. But if you actually look at, say, Irish material, you're looking at a totally different way in which people talked about the whole thing, where Saint Patrick emerges almost like a sort of trickster god in Celtic mythology, who will gain privileges from the local aristocrats, who in a battle of wits will gain solid privileges for mere Latin phrases. That made me really sit up. And then I realized that if you read Norse, Icelandic literature, you would have a very different picture of how it happened. And then if you learned Armenian, which is one of the joys of the 1990s for me, you had yet another picture. So it's that clashes of memory and how they are remembered. I think that's what a historian can contribute. Obviously, as a citizen or as a thinking person, one has got to go beyond that. One has to say, are these stories relatively innocent ways of keeping a link with the past, or is there something truly toxic? And I think the detoxification of grand narratives has in fact been one of the achievements of the 1990s, of the 2000s. But they are very sad achievements, because they are gained against a truly shocking resurgence of confident, brutal narratives all over Europe, all over the Middle East. We've got to sort of change stories. And a historian's there to at least play his or her part in what is, of course, the duty of an entire society to try to come to terms with.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for jumping from one question to the other. I wish we had hours to dwell on each one of these topics, but with your permission, I will just jump to another question, if that's okay with you. But I will encourage everyone to ask a question about the stories and re-narration and detoxification of stories. So let's put a pin right there. But I want to talk a little bit about the end product of your scholarship. We talked a little bit about the input, right? Your background, then your experiences throughout life, and how that impacted your scholarship is such a big question. And on the other side of that equation lies your output, your scholarship. And I know in the past decade or so, you've been writing in public venues like the New York Review of Books and other places about antiquity. So how do we talk about, in your understanding, how do we talk about a difficult topic like religious conflict in public venues? In scholarship, it's already a difficult topic, and you explained the difficulties of methodology and approach. But then our responsibility as historians also, as you show in your public scholarship, is to make that legible to a broader public. So personally, what do you pay attention to when you're writing for the public? And what do you recommend people, and how do you recommend people to talk about religious violence in antiquity?
I think the first thing that has always been very important for me, and I think I've made this plain in my autobiography, is I grew up in a culture where what people wrote was important. In a small country, people read newspapers, borrowed books, at least pretended to have read them, and certainly were often influenced. I do think that if one wanted to keep one's finger on the pulse of, say, the Ireland in which I grew up, reading the letters to the editor of the Irish Times, letters from relatively simple people offering all sorts of things, attacks on censorship, how to look after dogs, everything in between. And I think I grew up with the assumption that I was always writing for the general public. And I do think that if there is a real danger, it is that universities are constantly tempted in modern conditions, partly due to the very genuine professionalization of so many of the subjects studied. But there is a danger that we do come and turn in on ourselves. We adopt sort of hieratic poses. We use jargon, methodological fads who rush through us like sort of bushfires, but often make us turn away from the ordinary guys. And I think that there is more room, and I do think that we must constantly be aware that although we are handling very high density, almost atomic radioactive material in our scientific way, we must not forget that there are average Joes out there. And hence, certainly, I've had the greatest good fortune because of the enterprise of an editor like Bob Silvers, to whom I owe an enormous amount, because he would send me books. He'd say, Peter, what can you write about this? And sure enough, I would pick one book out of maybe 10 that were sent to me, and basically boomed off. And I think that it's important to learn how to boom off. And I think that students should be told that part of their life might well consist of writing on technical issues, but in an open manner.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more question? Is that okay?
Take it
I'm
away.
sorry.
Please, please.
We found
This
Peter
is-
Pan.
this is great.
I'm sorry. I'm already getting indications that people are really they're very eager to speak to you. But I'm just going to ask one more very quick question and then leave the stage to them, if that's okay with you. I know we've been talking for a while. But I want to talk about the future. At the end of the journeys of the mind, you say that you are nowadays working on Ethiopia and you are reading material about Ethiopia in Ge'ez. So that left me wondering how that area of research changed your approach to religious conflict in antiquity. And then what are you doing these days? Just a final reflection on the future of your research would be really precious.
Well, that's a sort of big question, because at the moment, one of the joys of having written the book is that you don't have to worry about the next one for some time. And I must be absolutely frank on that. I'm happy to let my wheels turn. Ethiopia is in some ways a return to a constant concern, which is what different forms Christianity takes throughout the world. I mean, I really do think that a book such as my Rise of Western Christendom, which actually went out of its way to include lots of other Christendoms by way of comparison, I would regard this as one of the things which I did with most enthusiasm in the early 2000s. And in a sense, my interest in Ethiopia is an interest in yet one more Christendom, one more micro-Christendom, at the very end of its, how to put it, of its cultural supply line. It is a long way from Ethiopia to Egypt, a long way from Ethiopia to St. Catherine's of Sinai or to Jerusalem. What gets through? What books are really read and copied and carried in a society which faces very different problems, very different notion of what the poor are, for instance. I was, in fact, drawn to Ethiopia when I was working on poverty, because this in some ways splendid society had very, 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 very different views of how you handled the poor, the beggars, the crippled. And I've always been concerned also to see how Christological issues of how exactly human and divine met in Christ, this great conundrum that everyone fought over from the time of the Council of Chalcedon, how does it show in practice? What is the difference between, say, an Ethiopian monarchy, which was, after all, at that time, the only monarchy left standing after the Islamic invasions? How did it conceive of itself as a non-Chalcedonian, as what we would call Monophysite Christianity? So to read the hagiography, to read the histories of the kings, and this is one of the most interesting aspects of Ethiopian culture, this constant tradition of actually writing down, telling stories, having a historical tradition, which we can trace at least from the Middle Ages onwards. Sort of picking away at that to see how do texts, practices, historical events come together to form a world with its own way of actually seeing the world.
Thank you so much. So we will stop recording now, but I will pass the microphone to our students. I think they have questions for you. So thank you again for taking the time to answer my questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.